I'm Sandra, a 28-year-old software developer living in Seattle with my parents, Susan and James. My life has been a complex mix of challenges and responsibilities, and the story I'm about to share is a reflection of that. After college, I struggled to find a stable job. I was eager to make a mark in the world, but the job market was unforgiving. It wasn't until I stumbled upon a freelance software development opportunity that things started to change. I began working from home, earning around $2,000 a month at first. The income was modest, but it provided me with a sense of purpose and control. As I gained more experience and took on larger projects, my earnings grew to a steady $5,000 a month. I was proud of my progress, and it allowed me to contribute significantly to my family's finances. However, living with my parents was not without its struggles. My mother, Susan, was very traditional and skeptical about my work-from-home job. Despite my explanations about remote work, she never seemed to fully grasp its legitimacy. "Sandra, how can you make so much money without leaving the house?" she'd ask. She was always worried that my job was not real and often hinted that I might be involved in something dubious. No matter how many emails from clients or salary statements I showed her, Susan remained doubtful. The tension between us grew as she continued to spend money lavishly. Her shopping sprees often put extra pressure on our budget. Even with my contribution, which included covering $1,500 a month for household expenses and helping with utility bills and groceries, Susan's extravagant spending added to the strain. My father, James, tried to support us as best as he could, but his pension was just not enough. Things took a turn for the worse when James fell ill. His health deteriorated rapidly, and he was forced to retire early. His pension was reduced to just $1,200 a month, and with Susan's spending habits, it was clear that we were in financial trouble. I felt a strong sense of duty to support my parents, so I decided to stay home and manage our finances. I covered more of the household expenses, including the mortgage, which was $2,000 a month, and other bills. My contributions amounted to around $3,500 monthly. I hoped that my efforts would alleviate some of the financial burden from my parents. James, who had always been understanding and supportive, appreciated my help. "Sandra, thank you for everything," he'd say, his voice weak but sincere. Despite my best efforts, Susan remained ungrateful and continued to question my work. Our relationship was strained, and every conversation seemed to revolve around my job's legitimacy or her dissatisfaction with how I was managing things. Things became even more complicated when my brother, David, and his wife, Anna, decided to move back in with us. They arrived one evening, and I was shocked to see them at the door. Susan had invited them without telling me. David worked for a reputed company, and Anna was a housewife. I had always thought they were doing well financially, so their sudden move in seemed unexpected. David and Anna quickly began to treat me like an intruder in my own home. They demanded that I contribute more to the household chores, despite my busy work schedule. "Sandra, we need you to help with breakfast and cleaning," Anna said one morning, her tone sharp. I tried to explain that I was working and couldn't take on additional responsibilities. David and Anna's demands only added to the already mounting tension. Susan, who had always been critical of my work, now seemed to side with David and Anna. She echoed their frustrations and implied that I should do more around the house. The pressure was immense, and I felt suffocated. My contributions, both financial and otherwise, were overshadowed by their constant criticisms and demands. The turning point came when James's condition worsened, and he had to be hospitalized. The stress of managing the household while supporting my father became overwhelming. David and Anna, now fully settled in, pushed even harder for me to leave the house. They argued that my presence was unnecessary and that it was time for me to make way for them. I realized that I couldn't continue living in this toxic environment. Despite my efforts and sacrifices, I felt like an outsider in my own home. As the situation grew more hostile, I knew something had to change. The mounting tension was too much, and I had to consider what was best for me and my well-being. Sandra's story, as I've shared it so far, is a testament to the challenges of balancing familial responsibilities with personal dignity. As I faced growing hostility from my own family, I knew that making a difficult decision was inevitable. I had to decide whether to continue enduring the strain or to take a step that might finally bring me the peace I desperately needed. The journey ahead would be filled with tough choices and revelations, but one thing was clear. My life was on the brink of a significant change. Things started to unravel faster than I anticipated. With Dad's worsening condition and his hospitalization, the tension at home became unbearable. David and Anna's presence, instead of being a support, felt more like an added burden. The dynamic had shifted drastically, and I felt increasingly alienated. When Dad was admitted to the hospital, my daily routine became a whirlwind of managing household responsibilities and visiting him. The hospital bills were piling up, and despite my consistent $3,500 monthly contribution, the financial strain was evident. Susan's spending habits had not changed, and now, with the additional medical expenses, it was clear that we were running on thin ice. David, who had been working at a reputed company, was suddenly let go from his job. It was a blow to the family, as his salary was crucial to our finances. With him now unemployed, the financial pressure on me increased. David and Anna's move had already strained our budget, but now it was clear that my income, which had grown to $5,000 a month, was being stretched to its limits. Anna, who had always been critical, became even more demanding. "Sandra, we need to cut down on expenses. Why don't you do more around the house?" she would say, as if managing my software development work and covering a large portion of the household expenses wasn't enough. I felt trapped in a situation where my efforts were not only unappreciated, but also used against me. Susan's attitude only worsened. She sided with David and Anna, seemingly forgetting the sacrifices I had made. "Sandra, you need to do more," she'd say. Her demands were becoming unbearable. The constant questioning of my job and my role in the household made me feel as though I was being pushed aside in my own home. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of juggling work and hospital visits, Susan and David sat me down. They expressed their frustration over the state of the household and implied that I was not contributing enough. "Sandra, this isn't working out. We need to find a solution," David said, his tone laden with irritation. It was clear that their patience with me was running thin. The hostility was palpable, and it seemed that no matter how much I gave, it would never be enough. David and Anna's demands grew more unreasonable, and Susan's support for them left me feeling isolated. As the days passed, the atmosphere at home grew increasingly toxic. The conflicts between us were constant, and every small disagreement seemed to escalate into a full-blown argument. My efforts to maintain a semblance of normalcy were met with resistance and hostility. I was spending $2,000 a month on mortgage and $1,500 on other household expenses, but the constant financial pressure and emotional strain were taking their toll. The situation reached a breaking point when Susan, David, and Anna began to openly discuss the idea of me moving out. "Sandra, maybe it's time for you to find your own place," Susan suggested one afternoon. Her words were like a knife twisting in my side. I had already been feeling like a stranger in my own home, but hearing them talk about me leaving made me feel completely unwelcome. I knew that my decision to stay at home and support my family had been driven by a sense of duty and love. Yet, I couldn't ignore the growing resentment and the lack of appreciation for everything I had done. My financial contributions, my emotional support, and my efforts to balance work and home life seemed to be overshadowed by their demands and expectations. The weight of the situation was becoming too heavy to bear. I could see that my presence was no longer valued, and the hostility from David, Anna, and Susan made it clear that I needed to rethink my position. The idea of moving out, once a distant thought, now felt like an inevitable step towards reclaiming my dignity and peace of mind. As I navigated this tumultuous period, I started to plan my next steps. I knew that a difficult decision was approaching, and I had to consider what was best for my well-being. The toxic environment at home was stifling, and I needed to find a way to regain control of my life and finances. The days following the conversation with Susan, David, and Anna were suffocating. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, trapped between financial obligations and a family that no longer seemed to care about my well-being. The hostility was becoming unbearable, and I knew I had to act before things got even worse. The final straw came when I came home from the hospital after a long day to find David and Anna rearranging the living room. Susan had suggested they redecorate to make space for them, and now the living room, once my sanctuary, was filled with their belongings. I was stunned. "What's going on here?" I asked, my voice strained. David barely looked up from the sofa he was arranging. "We're making some changes. You'll need to adjust," he said bluntly. His tone was dismissive, as though my opinion didn't matter. I knew that this was more than just a simple rearrangement. It was a sign of how little regard they had for my feelings and my place in the house. They were clearly trying to push me out, and it became evident that my departure was not just a possibility, but an expectation. Later that evening, Susan, David, and Anna sat me down again. "Sandra, we've been discussing the situation," Susan began. "With the extra expenses from the hospital and everything else, we think it's best if you find a new place to live." I felt a surge of frustration. "You think it's best? I've been supporting this family with my salary. I'm the one keeping this house running," I exclaimed. David's face was set in a hard line. "We need a fresh start, and frankly, we can't keep up with the expenses with you here. You need to move out and make space for us." Their words were a punch to the gut. They were pushing me to leave, not because they couldn't afford to stay, but because they couldn't handle the reality of their situation and were taking it out on me. My monthly contribution of $5,000 was no longer enough to cover the mounting expenses, and their financial mismanagement had only added to the burden. That night, I sat alone in my room, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. I realized I had to take drastic measures to protect my own well-being. I decided to transfer the money I had been using to support the household into my own account. It was a sum of about $15,000 that I had saved up to cover my share of the bills, mortgage, and other expenses. I knew that this action would have serious consequences, but I couldn't keep pouring my money into a bottomless pit while being treated like an outsider in my own home. I set up the transfer late at night, feeling a strange mixture of relief and guilt. Relief because I was taking control of my finances and my life, but guilt because I knew it would leave Susan, David, and Anna in a difficult position. The next morning, I packed a few essentials into my car and prepared to leave. As I walked through the house one last time, I took a deep breath, trying to absorb the weight of the moment. The house that had once been a place of comfort and family had become a battleground of conflict and resentment. When I finally left, I felt a surge of liberation. I had made the decision to prioritize my own well-being and self-respect, even if it meant facing the consequences of my actions. I knew that leaving behind the toxic environment was necessary for my own mental health and future happiness. I moved into a small apartment in a quieter part of Seattle. The rent was manageable, and I could afford it with my software developer salary. It wasn't much, but it was my own space, a place where I could start to rebuild my life on my own terms. In the weeks that followed, I focused on my career and my well-being. I visited Dad regularly at the hospital, offering him the support and love that I could, despite the distance. I worked hard to ensure that my new life was grounded in stability and independence. Meanwhile, back at the family home, David and Anna struggled with the sudden financial strain. David, now unemployed, found it challenging to manage the household expenses. Anna, unable to handle the pressure, eventually left him, seeking her own path away from the chaos. Susan's spending habits had caught up with her. Without my financial support, she struggled to cover the bills and faced mounting debts. The reality of the situation hit hard, and the once lavish lifestyle she enjoyed was replaced by a grim struggle to make ends meet. As I settled into my new life, I felt a sense of accomplishment and peace. I had made a difficult choice, but it was one that allowed me to regain control of my own life. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was ready to face it with newfound strength and independence. The weeks turned into months, and as I settled into my new apartment, I found myself embracing a renewed sense of freedom. My small apartment in Seattle was a stark contrast to the bustling family home, but it was my sanctuary. It was where I could focus on my career as a software developer and begin to heal from the tumultuous past I'd left behind. The financial relief I experienced was immediate. With the $15,000 I had saved, I was able to cover the first few months of rent and set up my new place comfortably. I threw myself into work, finding solace in the rhythm of coding and the satisfaction of building something from scratch. My income was steady, and I was finally able to save money for myself, rather than funneling it into a household that didn't appreciate or respect me. The visits to Dad at the hospital became a highlight of my days. His condition was slowly improving, and though he was still far from fully recovered, seeing him more regularly brought us closer together. I made it a point to be there for him, offering both emotional support and practical help where I could. It was a small comfort amidst the chaos of my previous life. Back at the old family home, the fallout from my departure became evident. David struggled to manage the household finances. His termination from his job had left him in a precarious position, and without my $5,000 monthly contribution, he found it difficult to keep up with the bills. The stress of unemployment and financial insecurity took a toll on him, and his strained relationship with Susan only worsened. Anna, unable to cope with the mounting pressure and David's unemployment, decided to leave. She moved out of Seattle to start fresh somewhere else, leaving David to face the repercussions of our family's financial mismanagement alone. Susan, once so accustomed to a comfortable lifestyle, now faced the grim reality of mounting debts. Her spending habits had caught up with her, and she struggled to manage even the basic expenses. The house, once a symbol of prosperity, had become a source of stress and financial strain. Despite the turmoil, I found that I was growing stronger. My new life, though modest, was a testament to my resilience. I enjoyed the simple pleasure of organizing my own space and managing my finances without the constant interference and negativity from my family. I realized that my departure had been the catalyst for a much-needed change, both for myself and for them. One afternoon, as I was finishing up some work, I received a call from Susan. Her voice was weary, and there was a vulnerability in her tone that I had not heard before. "Sandra, I need to talk to you," she said. "Can we meet?" We arranged to meet at a cafe, and when I saw her, she looked worn and tired. Over coffee, Susan shared her struggles. She spoke of the mounting debts and the difficulty of managing on her own. The lavish spending that once seemed so natural had led her into a financial abyss, and she admitted that without my support, things had become nearly impossible. It was a difficult conversation, filled with mixed emotions. On one hand, I felt a sense of vindication. On the other, I was sympathetic to her plight. I had always wanted my family to appreciate the sacrifices I made, and seeing Susan's situation made me reflect on how things could have been different if there had been more understanding and less conflict. In the end, I offered Susan advice on managing her finances and suggested that she seek professional help to address her debt. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a way to support her from a distance, respecting the boundaries I had set for myself. As for me, I continued to thrive in my new environment. My career was on an upward trajectory, and my personal life was more stable than it had been in years. I had learned the importance of self-respect and independence, and I was committed to maintaining those values as I moved forward. Looking back, I realized that leaving was the hardest decision I had ever made, but it was also the most empowering. It marked the beginning of a new chapter where I could live for myself, make my own choices, and build a life that reflected my values and aspirations. My family's struggles were a stark reminder of the consequences of financial mismanagement and the importance of appreciating those who contribute selflessly. As I embraced my new life, I hoped that they, too, would find their path to resolution and growth.